Okay, today we're going to look at our second section of evolution. We're going to start to look at some causes of evolution. That's going to be the main gist of what we get out. The first thing that I want to look at today is the idea that evolution acts on populations, so groups of individuals together. It doesn't act on single individuals. And what I mean by that is that if one organism has a beneficial mutation or some adaptation, if it doesn't pass on its genes, if it were in isolation, so just one organism goes to an island, there's no way it can pass its genes on, no way it can pass that beneficial trait on, and so evolution won't occur. Evolution can only occur if there's groups of individuals that can pass their traits on to ancestors. So I gave over here the picture of our finch. If at some point, like let's say this medium ground finch, if there's no other medium-sized ground finches that it can mate with, it's going to disappear. So all we'd be left with was a large ground finch and the other ones. So there has to be other organisms to mate with. Evolution cannot happen to an individual. Even if that individual has a beneficial change and it can survive well, if it can't pass on its traits, no evolution. So when we think about groups of individuals, you could try to, instead of seeing them as just a group of organisms, think back to what you know about genetics and think of them in terms of the genes that they have, or genotype. The word that is used to describe that is gene pool, and that's all the possible combined genetics for members of a population. So the gene pool would be if you could look at all the genotypes and just put them together in like a bag, that would be your gene pool. That's all the possible genes that you have to draw from. So if we looked at for one trait color, let's say it's coat color in these boar, the gene pool would be all of the possible alleles that are together for the gene for coat color. So gene, again, it's the section of the DNA, it's a part of the DNA that codes for a specific protein and determines a trait. The allele is the different forms of the gene. I'll just for fun go over, this is heterozygous for the genotype, and this is homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, the different forms of the gene. Okay, genetic variation is going to come from two things. So what I mean by genetic variation is that the production of an offspring with new and unique alleles are going to come from two possibilities. I've given a picture for the first one. So you could have a father with a big nose, and you could have a mother with bushy eyebrows, and they produce a son that has a big nose and bushy eyebrows. So gene shuffling comes from reproduction. So the mixture of the alleles from the mother and father in their offspring. So there's gene shuffling. That's one way genetic variation occurs. The other way is through mutation. So new and unique traits don't pop up unless there's a change in the DNA. So if there's a mutation in the DNA that doesn't kill the organism, it's possible that could help the organism survive better. If it does that, then that organism is going to pass that mutation and that gene on. Its offspring will survive better, and that beneficial mutation is going to spread. Okay, so we're going to go through causes of evolution. We've got 5 of them. So this is the last set of slides for this section. First one that we're looking at is natural selection. We've talked about it before, and I'm going to go through it again. So I've got a nice little graphic here. The very first thing, you've got sexual reproduction. And we just talked about gene shuffling that happens when a mother and father come together. So here we've got a hairy caterpillar and a smooth caterpillar. If they were to reproduce, they'd produce a variety of offspring. Some might have hairy, some of the offspring might be hairy, some of them might be smooth. And in this example, that difference is going to be a difference in survival rate. So there's a struggle for survival. So then what happens is after organisms reproduce, not all their genes get passed on. And they don't get passed on because some of the the organisms die before they can ever reproduce again. So we call that the struggle for survival. So in the natural environment, living organisms face many problems. It can become from competition, from predators. So they could both be competing for food. They could have birds that are feeding on them. One can survive better in different climate conditions. So that brings us back to that genetic variation. So in each generation, individuals are going to have slightly different characteristics. Not all of us in the classroom look exactly the same. In our example, these two caterpillars don't look exactly the same. Some are more favorable in helping them individuals to survive. So then we've got the idea of, so first idea was struggle for survival. Next one is survival of the fittest. And what that means is doesn't mean that the most muscular caterpillar is going to survive. It means that individuals with favorable characteristics are better adapted to their environment, and they're more likely to survive and breed. So their timeline is going to continue. The other organism, individuals with less favorable characteristics, they're not going to survive long enough to breed, or if they breed and produce offspring, they're not going to produce as many offspring in the population. In this example, we've got the birds preferring to feed on these non-hairy caterpillars, and so they're dying out. You're going to see or in class today, you saw the example with the crickets. So survival of the fittest doesn't always mean that the better adapted organism is going to pass on its genes, because you can have sneaky organisms that are using the adaptations of other organisms to their own success. Okay, so then continuing on, favorable characteristics are passed on to future generations and become more common. So if in generation 1 there's 5 hairy and 5 non-hairy, the next generation, if we took a sample of 10 organisms, maybe there's 6 hairy and 4 non-hairy. It continues on, 7 hairy, 3 non-hairy, 8 hairy, 2 non-hairy. And eventually you just keep seeing more and more of that one type of trait. Okay, so had a good time to look at this. Second time we've looked through this kind of flow chart for natural selection. So I'll move on to the next one. What happens with natural selection is you can have, if we looked at the graph of the population, you're going to have 3 possibilities. I'm going to use the cursor to kind of track you along on this. Stabilizing selection means that you're going to have a balance. So let's say this was beak length in birds, and this is a short beak on this side and a long beak on this side. So you're watching the cursor over here. You've got the 2 different traits on the far edges of our graph. Now what happens in stabilizing selection is that the environmental conditions, whether it's predators or competition for food or mates or whatever it is going to stabilize the population. You're going to have a balance between beak length. So it's not going to be super short, it's not going to be super long, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. Then the other example would be, let's say this is the yellow is our original population. Directional selection means that if our beak length started off, we have short beak again and long beak, let's say it was like 2 centimeters to start. What happens in directional selection is that whatever the environmental conditions are, they're shifting the beak length to a longer beak length. Directional selection could happen either way. If our founding population was here, optimal arrow would be going this way, and we could shift our beak length in the population to a shorter beak. Think of it as an average, like the average beak length starting off is about, for our yellow example, was about, what did I say, 2 centimeters. Over time, if you sampled the population again in maybe 10 years, you would see a shift, and maybe it's 3.5 centimeters for the beak length. I just came up with the numbers, they're not really in here, just to show that basic idea that you're causing a shift in a trait in one direction. Okay, and then the third one that I'm going to talk about is disruptive. We're not going to worry about this one, so don't worry about balancing. Disruptive selection right here. What's happening is that some sort of split is happening in the environment where it's shifting there to be two types of populations emerging. Um, with our bird population, you can imagine there's some shift in the food source. And what happens is that instead of having this average beak length of 3 centimeters right here, we now have two populations emerging where we've got maybe a 2 centimeter beak length and a 5 centimeter beak length. Or it could be something like color. Maybe it's a white bird and a red bird, more towards red and more towards white. And some sort of shift happens in the environment and causes white to survive well and red to survive well. But the blend or the in-between is not doing very good. It dies off and we shift into two types of population. So those are three types of selection, the way they can occur. Okay, now we're getting to our second cause of evolution. Second cause of genetic drift. Genetic drift means that it's basically the change in allele frequency. And there's a couple causes for that. It could be small population size, and it could also be more descendants with a specific allele. So what happens is that you start with these 10 different alleles, and we've represented them with these colored punches. After several generations of random sampling, what that means is, like, after several years of reproducing and creating offspring, only 6 of the original alleles have left descendants. So that means, like, some of these other colors, like this purple color, or what else, this light blue, whatever happened in our environment, those colors that weren't successful didn't pass on their genes, and we're left with only these 6 alleles. And that could continue again in the future. So some more generations of organisms are produced, and now we're only left with 2 alleles from the original descendants. So genetic drift, you're going to have to look from, it's based on that starting sample. So whatever types of alleles you start with, and then your ending point for the alleles. What do the organisms look like if you could look at the alleles at the end after a lot of generations? If you look at that definition, the wording, random change in allele frequency, here the frequency is 1 in 10 for each one of these colors. And then you look here again at the end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. Now 9 out of 10 alleles are red and 1 out of 10 are blue. So the frequency of red alleles is increased. The frequency of blue alleles has just about stayed the same. And these other ones, other alleles have decreased. Okay, so what would cause genetic drift? Let's look at some examples in populations. So one way you can look at it is the founder effect. So what that means is, let's say we've got this group of ladybugs, and they're on the mainland. And they crawl into somebody's suitcase. That person went over to Hawaii for spring break. The ladybug crawled out of the suitcase. It would kind of be better if we had 2 ladybugs, wouldn't it? Because this ladybug's not going to just multiply by itself. But original population, you've got red and yellow. You've got 2 different alleles. Only one type of allele makes it to the island. So Parker brought over like 1 red ladybug or 2 red ladybugs. Those like start to populate Kauai, and in like 30 or 40 years now you've got this whole island filled with red ladybugs. They don't, this red population doesn't represent the original population. You know, there was a balance at the beginning. After it got in the suitcase, there's only the red example. The next one is bottleneck effect, and that usually is going to happen because of some sort of like drastic event or change in the environment. So at one point you've got this large genetic diversity. You've got a lot of different organisms. Then there's a bottleneck. So let's say the tsunami hit and it kills off like all of, most of the organisms, maybe it's the ladybugs. So our same group of organisms, tsunami hits, kills off a bunch of them, and you're going to have less genetic diversity from the original population. And in the definition, it's pretty similar to what I was just saying, that the surviving population no longer represents what the original population looked like. Okay, now third cause of evolution. Each one of these next ones are going to have just one slide. Mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. So I touched on this earlier, and I'm going to go back to the sickle cell anemia trait. So sorry, Cameron, for having to say that again. But sickle cell anemia is when we change one amino acid in the normal blood cell. It's going to look like that. Here in our sickle cell, we've changed one amino acid here. And the sickle cell is going to have a little bit different form. It's going to look different, and it's going to have a little bit different function than a normal blood cell. So that's an example of mutation. It's an actual change in the DNA. One base pair changed, one amino acid changed, change in form and function. It's possible to have a mutation that does not kill an organism. It's also possible to have a mutation that is beneficial and helps the organism to survive better. Number 4, gene flow. Gene flow is basically just, it's easy to think about it in terms of immigration. So think about the United States. If you were to go back to like North America before European settlers arrived, the genes in North America are going to be Native American genes. Europeans come over. That's a flow of genes. They're bringing new alleles, white skin, different hair colors, different eye colors. So that flow of those genes coming into North America. Eventually, our population of Native Americans decreases. So their genetic characteristics in the population get smaller. Characteristics of Europeans increase and get larger. In our picture over here, we've got immigration with a beetle population, and it's fun that we've drawn in green and brown. These two beetles are heterozygous, but the brown allele is dominant. Here we've got a homozygous beetle. They fly in here. This was our initial founding population. As brown beetles fly into this area, it's going to cause an increase in the frequency of brown genes and brown alleles. And the very last thing, it's our number 5, fifth cause of evolution, is non-random mating. Non-random mating is just like it sounds. It's when individuals with a particular trait choose to mate with each other. So non-random mating would be if this dark brown beetle chooses to mate with any of the tan, the dark brown, or the light brown beetle. Non-random mating would be if females or males only selected for a particular, in this example it's color, so they're just selecting based on color. In the peacock example, if you remember back to the example I gave a long time ago about peacocks, if a male peacock has a really long tail, better chance that they're going to find a female to mate with. So that's an example of non-random mating. Females select males with a longer tail. So they look for a particular trait in their chosen mate. That's the last example for evolution. So take the notes. We're going to use these notes in class on Monday and Tuesday of next week.